All right, so I would just ask you to mute. Welcome to those who have just joined us. We started the 10 Commandments last time, and we're going to continue today, and probably finish, though I'm not sure, because there's really a lot to say about the 10 Commandments. As you must have gathered, last time we really only looked at a couple of them. I do want to mention a couple of things about them as a whole that I failed to mention last time. The first is that they are all, in the Hebrew, it's not so clear in the English, right? But in the Hebrew, they are in the singular. In other words, when it says, "You shall not swear falsely," the Hebrew is clear that it's referring to you in the singular, right? Lo tisa, not lo tisu, not you collectively, not y'all. I have to say the Southerners have a good thing here where they distinguish between singular and plural, right? So the idea here is that these commandments, and I'm going to give you one exception, we're going to come to it, but these commandments are addressed to everyone individually. You could argue that they're addressed to the Jewish people. And indeed, there's a great deal in the Torah which reads that way. But here the emphasis is on individual responsibility as well as collective responsibility. We generally put a lot of emphasis on collective responsibility. That's why, for example, on the high holidays, when we confess our sins, we don't say, "I sinned," but "we sinned." Right? The idea is we are all together in it, and we are responsible for each other. That's the usual. Here it's more pointed. You, each one of you. The second thing I wanted to point out is that if you look at the structure of the commandments, the first several are commandments that we are asked to observe with respect to how we treat God, right? What our obligations are to God. And then that's followed by a series of commandments that have to do with how we treat other human beings, right? So have no other gods before me, don't make idols. That's all about God. When we get to, don't steal, don't commit adultery, and so on, that's between us. Though God is also involved, right? A sin against a human being is also a sin against God. And it's important to emphasize that. And we see that also in the high holidays, right? Where we confess to God that we've treated we've gossiped, for example. Not just harmed other people. This is an affront to God. So, starting with commandments between us and God, continuing with commandments between us and other people. And the other thing is, and I just saw this in a commentary, I never really thought about it. They move in a decreasing level of severity, right? So having another God before you is much more severe than using God's name in vain, right? Which is the one we're about to begin. And you can think about not murdering as much more severe than not coveting, right? You see, you work God to human beings, and then from most severe to less severe. The other thing is that these commandments are unlike most of the others in that they are not conditional. Most commandments in the Torah say, if this happens, you should do that under these circumstances. Here they're very clear. And in fact, as we come to the latter ones, we get don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery. We're not even, it's categorically, it's not in some sense situational. A lot of Jewish law is situational, not here. Okay, so having said that, I want to turn to the next commandment. We're at the top of page 1019. 1019, and we are going to take a look at verse 11, which is Lo tisa et shem Adonai Elohecha lashav. Don't swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God. So it's actually more complicated than it looks. First of all, what name are we talking about? If you see Lo tisa et shem Adonai, right? So one way to read this, and in general it's read that way, is don't use God's specific name, which is Yud He Vav He, in swearing a false oath. In other words, let's say I swear to God that I'll do this. You're not violating this commandment, right? It's very nebulous. It's a kind of speech, but as Adonai lives, or may Adonai punish me if I don't, those are false oaths. Those are violations of this commandment. Now, having said that, I also want to point out that it's not really Adonai, because Adonai, which means my Lord, is a substitute name. God's name, which is probably, at least to us, unpronounceable by tradition, is Yud He Vav He. Some modern scholars think it's pronounced Yahweh. It's certainly not pronounced Jehovah, which was taking the vowels of one name and interposing it on the vowels of another. But however you pronounce it, that's what we're talking about. Now, what does it mean to take God's name in vain? In some sense, it means swearing falsely, right? But there's another level to it also, and that is swearing an oath that about something which is vain. And the classic example of that is, let's say that you're coming down the street and there's a fire at the end of the street, and you say like, Adonai, let it not be my house. If it is my house, I will do X or Y. I will make a donation to the synagogue, something like that, right? That's a false oath. It's a vain oath because it either is or it isn't, right? You're not, it doesn't, using God's name in vain in that case means you're using God's name about something which either is or isn't. Right? So it doesn't mean using God's name in general, right? If you look at the book of Ruth, Boaz, who is this figure in the book, sort of the male hero, Ruth is the female heroine, right? And they come together. Boaz is constantly using God's name. He comes to the reapers and who work for him, and he uses God's name as a form of greeting, right? So it's not using God's name in general, that at least biblically is forbidden, and it's not, it's swearing using God's name to something which you don't actually mean. If I say, as God lives, I will repay you the $10,000 I owe you, and you don't do that, you're violating this commandment because you're trivializing God. You're saying that God is impotent to punish you. And that's what's meant by the latter part of this commandment. The Lord your God will not clear one who swears falsely by his name. Now, in general, we're not talking about criminal procedures here. We're going to come to that in a later commandment. Okay, so I want to stop here for a minute and come back to the various things that I've said, particularly around this, but also around this structure, and see if there are any questions or comments before we move on to Shabbat. Anything at all? Hannah?
Yeah, I don't understand if Yahweh is unpronounceable, how it could be enforced anyway. Was that
right.
on purpose, having him
So
that no one could say as a
in
protection?
biblical times, it seems not to have been unpronounced. We've lost the secret of how to pronounce it. We have a rabbinic tradition that it was only used by the high priest on Yom Kippur, right? The idea that you should not pronounce God's name, not that it's unpronounceable. We don't know the pronunciation, right? But it's not that it's unpronounceable. It's simply that one should not use it. And we get this idea that perhaps people stopped using it because of this. It's not really clear. Yeah, Sandy, you had I think.
Oh, yeah, I just gonna ask you, Rabbi, what you're saying about these oaths, it must be out loud. Is that correct? You can't.
Yes, 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 it has to be out loud. Anything else? Okay, we're gonna move on to Shabbat.
One thing.
Yeah, Saul.
Yeah, it's interesting because in Jamaica, you know, and if you listen to reggae music, they use the word Jah.
Yeah. Well, so one of the names of God, of course, not the one we're referring to here, is Yah.
Yeah.
In Hebrew, right? So is Jah, and think about Jehovah, right? So you could see how Yah becomes Jah. But yeah. But if they swear by Jah, according to Jewish law, they're not violating this commandment. Okay, let me ask you to mute again, and I'll change the view. Okay, so let's go to the next commandment. So two things. The first thing is, you will see, I'm just going to read this quickly and we're going to come back to it. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. Now compare that, I'm talking about language now. Compare that to, you shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, right? What's the difference in structure? The difference is that we've shifted from second person to third person, right? That the Lord your God, it is a Sabbath of the Lord your God, right? The Lord your God commanded you. It doesn't say, it is my Sabbath, right? We're talking about God here, right? And this is the Sabbath that belongs to God. Right? So this shift between second person for the previous commandments and third person here, right, is a basis for this idea, which I mentioned last time, that actually beyond the first commandments, the people do not hear directly from God. We've already seen a hint in the text that Moses is kind of an intermediary, but now Moses is talking about God. Before, Moses was speaking God's words. Okay, so I want to emphasize that it's a little bit different. And we have this midrash that the people only heard the first couple of commandments. Okay, I want to ask you to turn back, hold this place, but turn back to page 446. Because I want to look at basically what we've seen up to now is more or less the same as if you went back to Exodus, you would see that original, right? This is Moses repeating the 10 Commandments to this new generation. But Exodus is where they first received them. So we're going to go back to page 446. And we're going to actually, let's go back to 445. I'm sorry. So remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, or sanctify it. Right. So the word remember here, we're going to see that it's going to say not remember, but in the version that we're going to look at, observe. Is it the same? Is it different? We'll come back to that. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your male or female servant, your cattle, the stranger who is in your settlements. We're going to see that's more or less the same. And now here is an explanation. For 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them. In it, God rested on the seventh day. Therefore, God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. So the reason for Shabbat here, creation. God, so we're going to observe the same holiday in a sense that God observed. God blessed it, God sanctified it. Okay, now we're going to go back to our text. And we are back on page 1019. And looking here, first of all, it says Shamor. There it said Zachor. Zachor means remember. Shamor means to observe. And you could distinguish between. Remembering things is like saying, today is Shabbat. It's beginning Friday night. It's beginning now. Right? That's remembering. Observing is not working, reading Torah, whatever you do on Shabbat as a form of observance. Right? In general, the tradition has treated these as synonyms, but there are differences. So, for example, the rabbis say, remember. How do you remember? You remember it over a cup of wine. In other words, the fulfillment of the commandment to remember is making Kiddush. That's how they treat it. Whereas Shamor, right, which is sort of not only observe, but kind of guard, protect, right? All of that has to do with many of the regulations of Shabbat. We're going to come to those regulations, at least in overall view, shortly. Okay, so what does the word Shabbat, or actually the Hebrew word Shin Bet Taf means? It means to cease, right? To cease, to stop. So, why? Because on this day, God ceased from whatever work means when you talk about God, right? It's an odd word. So we'll think about that in a minute. I want to also point out, this is in the 10 Commandments. I want to say that because, there are an awful lot of people walking around who say, well, yeah, I observe the 10 Commandments. Like 10 Commandments are fundamental. But they don't observe Shabbat, not in any sense, right? So it's worth sort of paying attention to the fact that if we want to look at what's really deeply fundamental in terms of how we treat God, this is in there. This is a positive commandment. But everything up to this point has been negative, right? Um, we're talking about God being the one who brought us out of Egypt, therefore don't have other gods, therefore don't make my idols, therefore don't use God's name in vain. But here, what we're doing is we're talking about something positive. This is what God expects. This is a day which God sanctified, and therefore we are to sanctify it. It is a day which belongs to God. And the observance of it is viewed as absolutely critical, at least traditionally in Judaism. Perhaps the most important positive commandment. It was the case that someone who did not observe Shabbat was not considered to be able to provide witness testimony. You're not a valid witness if you don't observe Shabbos, because what does Shabbos mean? It means that you are denying yourself certain material gain. If you're not willing to do that, right, how do I know that what you're claiming in terms of some monetary matter is even true? Right? So we do have that sense traditionally that this is absolutely central. So what are you to do? Sheshet yamim tavod v'asita kol melachtecha. 6 days you should work and do all of your milacha. I'll come back to the word milacha in a minute. I'm not going to translate it as work. All your milacha. One thing you might notice about this is that there seems to be a commandment to work, right? 6 days thou shalt work. And in fact, in rabbinic literature, they ask the question of, what about someone who has lots of servants? Let's say a woman has lots of servants. Her time is completely her own. Anything in the household she would have to do, getting done by someone else. Rabbinic tradition is she's got to do a little bit. Yeah, right? There is this sense that people need to be employed, and that if you're not, it can lead to bad things, right? Idle hands lead to all kinds of thoughts and actions. So there is, at least in some sense, this is being read not merely as the imperative to cease from work, but also the imperative to work. What is work here? Malacha seems to have something to do with creation or destruction. Anything that changes the world in some way, changes creation. That is the world that God created, right? So the idea is, well, let me give you an example. It doesn't have to do with effort. Something could really be minimal in terms of the amount of exertion that it requires and still be a violation. And something could, require a great deal of exertion and not be a violation. So to give you one example, the rabbis ask the following question. A person drags a heavy table, and assuming a dirt floor. Is that a problem? Yes, according to some, it's a problem, but why? Not because of the exertion in schlepping the table, but because it could drag on the ground and create a furrow. That changes things. And actually, it's more than that, because furrows are used for planting, and planting is a violation, right? So you see the difference there. The exertion itself is not enough. To give another example, the rabbis say that writing is a violation of Shabbat. How much effort does it take to pick up a writing implement and make a few marks? Nothing to do with effort. It has to do with changing, creating, destroying, making the world a different place. Now, how do we get a list of these things? So very cleverly, the rabbis tie this to the construction of the tabernacle in the wilderness, right? So the creation of the tabernacle, right, which God commands, is called Melechet Avodah. It uses the word malacha, work, right? It's fine work in that case, right? So they say malacha here, malacha there. And so they enumerate 39 categories of work that were used with respect to the tabernacle. And they say doing any one of those things would be malacha. And they're major categories, they're not minor details. But to give you an example, because I mentioned writing, so remember that the tabernacle, which was the portable shrine in the wilderness that was picked up and put down and reassembled. The rabbis say, actually, how did they reassemble it? How do they know which piece goes with which piece? There were markings, right? They wrote. Right? That was necessary for the establishment of the tabernacle and its use, and therefore is a violation of Shabbat. So it all gets tied in some way to or another. There's also a famous rabbinic statement, though, that the laws of Shabbat, the numerous laws of Shabbat, are like a mountain hanging by a hair, right? It's attached to something, right? A slim attachment, and then it becomes huge. Lots and lots of considerations in terms of Shabbat. Okay, so because it's tied to the tabernacle, and because Shabbat is also God's day, and this is a way of honoring God, within the tabernacle itself, and later on within the temple, things that are forbidden in general are permitted in terms of divine service. You cannot slaughter an animal on Shabbat. You have to have done it before Shabbat so that it is prepared and ready. And you can't burn that animal either. But you can slaughter and burn an animal on the altar on Shabbat. Because that is for God, and this is God's day. And that's different from doing something in order to feed yourself, where you could have made and should have made preparations in advance. Remember also that this commandment is so fundamental that when the Israelites were in the wilderness, God provides manna every day for them to eat. They go out in the morning and collect it, but on Fridays, they get a double portion, right? So they don't have to collect it on Shabbat. Right? Every day, the manna which fell, you'd have it for that day, and then it would rot. You couldn't save it. But the manna that fell on Friday was whatever was left over, you got the next day. Right? So this is so fundamental in so many ways, the way it's built into this narrative and the way it's really viewed as absolutely central in Judaism. I want to just look at who it applies to. You shouldn't do any work. Your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, and the Hebrew word really here is not just, it's servant, right? Anybody who works for you, whether they are slaves or free people who are in your employ, none of them are permitted to work. Your ox, your ass, any of your cattle, right? They get the day off, right? You can't hitch up your donkey, right? And there is a real concern here for animal welfare, which we see elsewhere in the Torah as well. So that if you, for example, if even the emotional harm that would be done to an animal, if you're going to take eggs from a nest, you have to shoo away the mother bird. You can't plow with an ox and a donkey hitched up to your plow because it's bad for the donkey. The ox is going to fall really hard and the donkey's going to get schlepped along. There's a whole host of regulations, and this is one of them. The idea and the stranger, right, who is in your midst, the resident alien, the person who lives among you. Right? And that is really striking, and it leads to a question, because, well, we have this idea known as the Shabbos goy, right? The stranger, the non-Jew who lives among you, according to this, is not permitted, right, to violate Shabbat. They're free. They don't get to work, and they don't have to work. So how does that work exactly? A lot of early authorities forbid it. It's pretty clear, right? And more than that, there's another principle as well. And that is someone's agent is like the person. There's no agency for violating Jewish law. I can't say, do this for me. I've made you my agent, therefore it's as though I did it, right? So in general, the idea of a Shabbos goy is a problem. The Jewish law kind of gets around it. It becomes, as society becomes more complex, it becomes more important. And so the traditional way of getting around it is you don't ask them to do it. But you might say, if you don't use electricity, or let's say the heat is out in your house, well, it's really cold in my house. Or it's really dark. And that non-Jew understands, you're not asking that, right? But they understand. But the idea here really is, and by the way, if you have servants and they're customarily come in, do all kinds of things for you, you serve yourself on Shabbat. They don't serve you. Okay, so as we look at this, what's the rationale? Why is it? And here we get a reason. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, God has commanded you to observe Shabbat. If you remember back when we looked at the parallel passage in the book of Exodus, it didn't say anything about this. Why does it say that we are to observe Shabbat in Exodus? For in 6 days, God made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day, God rested. Right? So here, I think the emphasis is different. Why? Because these people, that was before slavery, that was before Egypt, right? And now we have this idea of what it means to be a slave, this idea that we are freed from that for 1 day, at least a week. And this is also out of gratitude to God for this gift that God has given us, bringing us from slavery to freedom. So we have two different explanations for Shabbat. One is Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit, the remembrance of the acts of creation. And the other is Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. And both of these actions actually continue to be sort of combined as we remember Shabbat. And you see it in the Kiddush, which is recited on Friday night, where we both consider it to be Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit and also Zecher L'Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? So we've combined what we have in Exodus and in Deuteronomy as we think about the rationale for observing this. Okay, so that's a lot about Shabbat, and so I'm going to open it up and ask if people have questions or comments. Michael, you're first.
Okay, getting back to the Shabbos Goy, it always gets me, we can get around any law we want. You say we don't ask the Goy to do something. We have people set up for Kiddush on Shabbos, clean up for Kiddush, armed guards at the entranceway. They're being told what to do. Maybe not set up now, but
Right. So that, yes, you can make it a part of someone's general job responsibilities. Whenever the congregation gets together and food is served, you're in charge of it, right? You're not asking them to do it on Shabbat. In fact, if there's an event that takes place, a speaker or something, and there's coffee and cake afterwards, yes, that's their job, whatever, right? So we're not asking them specifically, but I take your point. having
so many laws are like that.
Well, I would take issue with that, but there are laws like that, right? And there are classic ones, selling your chametz on Passover to a non-Jew because you're not allowed to have it in your house, and it becomes a tremendous financial loss to get rid of it, right? So we have that workaround. There's the workaround, very famous workaround, that on the 7th year, all debts are canceled, right? But that's a big problem, because then people don't loan each other money, and the poor don't get the relief they need. And so Hillel says, well, yeah, you can't, it shouldn't be repaid, but it could be repaid to a court, and then the court could repay it to the lender, right? So these things clearly are part of the fabric of Jewish. Generally speaking, they are there because the law doesn't itself quite work. They're called takanot, and it literally fixes, right? There's something broken. Let's take the Shabbos Goy. Shabbos is supposed to be a day of delight, right? So you're going to sit in a cold, dark house. Doesn't quite work, right? You're not going to ask the non-Jew to do it, right? But you're not, the non-Jew doesn't feel any obligation to do it. They're not, in general, your servant, right? I take your point, but I would also say that most laws have no workarounds.
Have no what?
Have no workarounds, right? No legal fiction.
Well,
It's
all
really-
the Shabbos things, you put a string around your community and you can carry, you can do this, do that.
Yes.
That's working around the law.
Yes, it is working, but that again is one exception, and there just aren't a lot. So here's the problem with the Eruv, right? The idea is you're not supposed to take things from in your house outside, right? Or outside.
Yeah, but isn't that getting
Right,
around the law?
Right. Yeah, it is. So let me explain to you. So what does that mean? It means, so I was in synagogue in Israel, and there was a snowstorm, which is rare, but in Jerusalem it happened. So I go to synagogue on Friday night, and someone at the service announces, the Eruv is down. The wire that surrounds the community, which allows people to carry, it fell down. Oh, the storm, right? So this woman gets up and she goes over to the guy who announces it, and she picks up her young child and she says, here, right? Because she can't carry it home and she can't push her stroller. What is the problem? The problem is that observing Shabbat in part requires us to be part of a community. And in order to facilitate that, we have this picture. Now, by the way, there are lots of very traditional Jews who say, I don't hold by the Eruv, meaning it's too much of a workaround. It's in the Talmud. There's a whole section of the Talmud about it, but you can understand why someone would say, Michael, as you said, right? In general, there aren't a lot of these, and there are lots and lots of things that we are not allowed to. But there are workarounds. So I'll give you one more workaround, just because I think it's interesting. Something that was developed in Israel in the 20th century. You can't write. So what do you do if you're a doctor and you're in the hospital and you have orders that you have to write? So you could say, well, you're saving a life, right? And therefore you can. But maybe there's a better way. So what's the better way? Disappearing ink, right? So you write your note using ink, which within 24 hours is gone. Now, remember, the purpose here is not to change the world, right? Anything that is impermanent, right, is not considered to be. Let's say let's say you're down at the seashore and you go down to the tide line, and like kids do, you write something in the sand. But the ocean is going to come and wipe it away. That's not really writing. It has to be permanent. Anyway, so this is a worker.
When you gave that example, the doctor writing a prescription, but I never thought of this before. The doctor taking care of patients on Shabbos.
Right.
He's working. And he's not saving lives all the time. It could be a splinter in somebody's finger. So not
Right.
things
But
that are not going to kill you.
He has to, well, two things. A, he has to be there and be available if someone's life is in danger.
Yeah.
And B, we take the notion of health and life very broadly, and the Jewish tradition always has. And that is a clearly worked out exception. It's not a workaround. That's different. But here, even though it's permitted, if there's a way to do it with less violation, then that's to be desired. I'll give you another example. So a person who has a disease where I'll give you a better example. Somebody has been impressed. This is a famous case. He's been impressed into the Russian army. Part of being in the Russian army is you got to eat treif because you have no options, right? So the classic story, someone goes to the rabbi, he says, what am I going to do? And the rabbi says, well, you have to eat it, you can eat it. Don't suck on the bones, right? There is a sense you try to minimize it, it shouldn't bring you pleasure. Someone who has to eat on Yom Kippur because of their health is not supposed to sit down and just eat a meal. Have a little bit more later on, and so on, right? So the desire here is to minimize violation to the extent that you can, while honoring Shabbat as much as you can. Another thing, if you have to do something which would be a violation of Shabbat and you have no other way to do it, and it has to be done, you're supposed to do it in a way that wouldn't be the way you regularly do. Don't use your hands, use your elbow, something, right? Because at least you're saying, yes, I know it's Shabbat. Yes, this is something under ordinary circumstances I'm not permitted to do. In this case, I have to do it, therefore I'll do it. Okay, any other questions or comments on Shabbat? Go ahead, Sandy, and then Saul.
So, Rabbi, you said that the construction of the tabernacle had
Yes.
the 39 categories of work that we're not supposed to do. So my question is, how does that, we're the year 2023 and all sorts of things that we have now, we're not in the tabernacles. So how is that pertain to today? Plus,
Yes.
how does it pertain to that you're not supposed to add or subtract to the
Okay.
commandment.
So the idea of adding and subtracting means making things completely new, right? The desire is the question now I have is, I have a law, it says you can't do malacha on Shabbat, right? I'm not adding a new law, but I want to know, can I use my Kindle in Shabbat, right? In other words, under the general law, what can I say about this thing that didn't exist before,
Mhm.
right? Can I use electric lights on Shabbat? And now we have to deal by analogy. Right? So the whole question of using electricity on Shabbat, there's a fundamental difference between Orthodox Jews and some conservative Jews over this issue. Right? Everybody agrees that it's forbidden to use fire on Shabbat, right? That's inherent. You can look at the tabernacle, it's simple. So the question is electricity like fire? Right? And in some ways it is, right? Fire gives you light, gives you heat. Ordinarily you would cook over, right? A lot of things, fire is like electricity. So you could say, can't use fire, you can't use electricity. You could also say, yes, it's got similar uses, but we know what electricity is, and we know what fire is, and they're not the same. So there were those conservative Jews who say, it's not fire, I'm going to use it. There are others who say, yeah, no, but too similar to fire, can't use it, right? So that's how, you're not making new law, you're not adding, right? You're simply interpreting something which is meant to be eternal and deal with life not just as it was in biblical times, but for Jewish life, as long as there are Jews, and you're applying it. And there are all kinds of, people don't agree, right? You have to save a life, right? So does that mean you can turn off a respirator or not, right? These were not issues in the past, but they are, and it becomes interpretation, and people do disagree. But ultimately, the Jewish community does generally come to consensus. When you're in sort of the modern era, that's less likely. But at least the pattern has been through much of Jewish history that there is some consensus which develops. Saul, I think you want to say something.
Yeah, the text in the Elchanan mentions, I don't know if you did this before because I had to go out for a minute, but it mentions V'shorecha v'chamorecha v'chol behemtecha. So they added these two types of animals, and the hertz that I have this details it as Tsar Bali Chayim.
Yes, yeah, I did talk about it. I actually specifically mentioned that, and also a variety of other ways in which Judaism is concerned about animal life. Yeah, good. So I'm just trying to think before we leave Shabbat. One other thing I just like, because I think it's very cool. Hebrew, when you list the days of the week, right? Not Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, but Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi, right? First day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, Shabbat. Not Yom Shvi. If you're an Israeli and you say, I'll meet you on Monday, you say, we'll meet on Yom Sheni. Right? But if I'm going to see you on Shabbos, I will say I'll meet you on Shabbat. That's how fundamental it is. These things are worked deeply into not even just Jewish life, but Jewish language. And since we talked about also the commandment not to take God's name in vain, to use God's name in vain, it's worth noting also that Hebrew letters are used to reflect numbers traditionally. right? Not Arabic numerals. So Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3, and so on. And you could take any word and give a numerical value to it, which is a whole mystical tradition called gematria, where you learn things from the numerical. So when you get to 10, that's Yud. And then, like you might expect, 11 is Yud Aleph, 12 is Yud Bet, Yud Gimel, right? We're just going to go until we get to 20, which is Kaf. It's the next level, and then Kaf Aleph, Kaf Bet, right? Okay. When you get to 15, that should be Yud He, but it isn't. It's Tet Vav. It's 9-6 instead of 10-5. Why? Because Yud He is 2 of the letters in God's name. This is how fundamental these laws are, and written into the very language of Judaism, which I think is astonishing, really. Okay, so I'm going to give you, because we are out of time, even though we only covered 2 commandments this week, but such is the nature of it. We'll pick up with honoring parents next time. I'll just mention, actually, we're done now with the commandments about God. We are going to move on next time, so it is a good break, to the commandments between man and man, except that the first one we look at, honoring parents, some people would consider a commandment between man and God, because we learn by honoring our parents how we honor God. But I'll come back to that. Okay. Any last questions?
Real
Michael?
quickie. In Israel, do they have a word for Monday, or do they say Yom Sheni? What
They
is
say Yom Sheni.
it? That's the word.
That's the
Okay.
word. That's
Okay.
how you say Monday in Israel, Yom Sheni, as opposed to Yom Rishon and Yom Shlishi. Right?
Yeah.
That's the point, right? Every day is the same. Shabbat is different. It breaks the pattern. To say that Shabbat is not just a day of the week, it's separate, it's different, it's sanctified. Okay, well, this has been great. We'll pick up.
No, I'll say goodbye.
Okay, and I will see you in 3 weeks. Again, remember, no class next week, no class the week after that. We'll be in warmer climes. And I look forward to seeing you then. Have a great week, everybody.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.